the conference. And without further ado, we will start to introduce our first speaker, Dr. John Spink, who's going to talk to us about food fraud prevention. Dr. Spink is the director and lead instructor for the Food Fraud Prevention Academy and an assistant professor in the Department of Supply Chain Management in the Eli Broad College of Business at Michigan State University. His food fraud prevention research focuses on policy and strategy to understand and prevent supply chain disruptions and to implement procurement best practices. He's widely published in leading academic journals and has helped lead national and global regulatory and standards activity. Recently, his teaching and research has expanded to supply chain disruption management and procurement best practices. For more information, you can visit the Food Fraud Prevention Academy website at www.foodfraudmooc.com. Welcome, Dr. Spink.
Thank you. How's my sound?
Very good.
Good. All right.
Yeah.
And then if I can share screen. It says that the host has disabled participant screen sharing. I can probably wing it, but it's usually better with a couple visual aids.
The slides do tend to help. Just give us a second here.
Sure. I once walked into a classroom of about 90 students, and all of a sudden there was no overhead projector, and I didn't have my notes with me. And I actually, as someone later said, I hit on almost every one of the points. You know, for that base introduction lecture, I'd done it so many times. But you're getting some new stuff today, so there'll be some I'll need a little more guidance for myself to stay on track. I think I could probably talk about 2 days worth of this. Well, I'll start a little bit just to say thank you. I'm really pleased to be here. For the couple of years we've tried to work this out, and it just hasn't happened. This is a great year to talk about food fraud prevention. There's a lot of, I think that as we're coming, knock on wood, out of COVID, that there's going to be a lot more oversight back on what we haven't done over the last couple of years, because we've all been focused on just assurance of supply. And so it's a good time to look at it. And I'll definitely cover the role of governments and agencies in this, as well as a little bit of that background. It's been fascinating. Yes.
Sorry, John, you're now a co-host. You should be good to go.
Let's do that. All right, that should pop up. You can see that.
It's coming. Yep, there we go.
All right. Well, it's been fascinating. Some of you I've known directly or indirectly over the years, and I've moved around MSU quite a bit. There, beginning in 2009, was in criminal justice, criminology, and focused on the bad guy. But that was just that was one part of it. That wasn't the whole picture. But I learned a lot about how people think that what they do is okay, and that world of sociopaths and criminals, that there are people out there. And then it was in food safety for a while, but the last going on my third year, I'm here in the Department of Supply Chain Management. That's really critical for us all, because I'm now coming at this from the business side of things and the organization of the supply chains themselves, and it's becoming just a standard operating procedure. So everything that we've been doing in the past still applies. It's just we're getting a little bit more help, I guess, with it. So now I'll also put in here a bonus of cybersecurity. And in about the last 2 months, and even in the last about 2 weeks, there's been a lot of increased focus on this. Specifically, what are the risks to the food supply chain, and what are our roles as food safety inspectors, managers, others in protecting this topic. So I've done a pretty deep dive in that, and you'll get some of that. So there's my contact information. I do want to interact with you, so definitely stay in touch. First off, just real briefly about resources we have. On the right, you'll see my food fraud prevention textbook. This is 700 and something pages long. It's comprehensive. So if you're dealing with food fraud prevention, managing it, trying to get some background, that's a great resource. I basically waited till it was felt like I'd covered the entire topic. And after GFSI was implemented, that's when it really seemed like the future was pretty clear. So it was time for a book was appropriate. And then on the left, you'll see the MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses, free. So share this with your staff, with your team, with companies. Again, the content is always free, and we update them not constantly, but pretty close to constantly. The first one was offered in 2013, so we've been doing this for a while, and they're not just going to come and go. And then the last two in red that we just really started more recently was organic fraud with the Organic Trade Association. So we went deeper into topics, and that's kind of as food fraud prevention matures and people implement it, we need more details. So that was really great to interact with them. And then enterprise risk management. That's really at the highest level how decisions are made in priority setting. And it does apply to governments as well. So there's a couple GAO reports about how the US government uses enterprise risk to set priorities. And then we were funded through the OTA group to do training for USDA inspectors. So these are probably two of my best works. They're intense, they're deep. USDA was very involved and pushed us in a lot of areas, and so was OTA and their members. So it's great as a background. So if you're starting to get into doing inspections of any kind, doesn't need to be organic. Those are really good foundations. I found them kind of fun to do because they do go into the background of criminals, criminology, and all that. So we're not doing any on-site activities this year because of COVID. Just a little bit about that, the Organic Integrity Learning Center and those two courses. There's the link there. Again, these are free online. The first one is Organic Fraud in the Criminal Mind. That helps to give us an understanding of how and why criminals act. That helps us understand the vulnerability because we can understand how they think. We look at some specific examples. And then Preventing Organic Fraud Opportunity. This is a combination of explaining what are best practices for a company, which would also count for a government or an agency, but also real specifically of how those USDA inspectors can be efficient in their activities. So if you're inspecting or getting inspected, it's good to know what those folks are, how they're getting trained. So that's a great resource. And then real briefly, so the food fraud prevention textbook looks at the topic from food science, food safety, those root causes into the problem. And then now that I'm teaching supply chain management, so I teach every business school student. So right now I have 850 students in 3 sections. So those are some big classes, but it's very basic. And we're going at food fraud prevention disruptions from the supply chain management side, the business side. So we're kind of going at it from both sides. And then what we've got is I've got some background noise. Hold on just one second. Sorry, I had the windows open with a nice breeze, but that was making some noise. I don't know if you could hear it or not, but I could. So this is looking at supply chain management, general basic concepts. So if you haven't been involved in this, then it'll be a good basic starting point. And then we get into the disruptions that starts to lead towards product fraud. Everything we're dealing with is COVID, all this craziness. We're looking at it from the real basic standpoint there. All the examples are food fraud prevention mainly. So this again is us coming together from both sides, and then also applying enterprise risk management, because this is the way that connects into corporations at the highest level and governments to make those decisions. So it's required reading here on campus. So that gives a little bit of a confidence that it's pretty tight. And really it's supply chain management, like our department, me teaching supply chain managers best practices for supply chain management. So we're going at it from that side of it. We no longer have to go convince purchasing or operations or logistics that they need to listen to us. This is just explaining it as good manufacturing practices. And then if you want to register to get information on it when it's published, then it's scmintro.com. So we've got resources. So whenever you hear about this stuff, don't think it's a new idea. There's no help out there. The MOOCs are short in videos. A lot of stuff's on YouTube, and then there's more resources. So there's plenty out there for you if you need it. So what we'll do is before getting into the some of the more prevention pieces in the role of the government, things like that, we're going to go through a little bit of background just to set the foundation. It'll build up a little bit slowly. I think this is also going to be good as a video that you'll have for resource in the future. And then we're going to get to the real decision making. So a little history to understand the requirements. So what's required in industry and in the real world. So we start with looking at incidents, and that's the first step in any hazard analysis, incident review. So we call these modern incidents because some people talk about Pliny the Elder, or the Roman, or all sorts of things that are way back in time. Frederick Acum, 1822, wrote a treatise on food adulterations, but those are a long time ago. Really, the modern ones that led us to action were first around 2004 was Sudan red. That was a carcinogen colorant. And it showed up every once in a while in things like paprika and spices. It was an adulterant substance, and it made it redder, looked fresher, I guess, or stronger. And consumers liked that. But it kind of popped up here and there. It gave us a little idea of like, well, something's going on. What's the motivation? Why does it pop up? It's not just like it's E. coli or aflatoxin, where you can say, well, if there's a lot of moisture in the region, then something will happen. This is different, but we really didn't have a foundation yet. 2007 was melamine and infant formula in pet food. This really got it on the map. So US Pharmacopoeia and others started to really work on this, looking at new test methods, things like that. But we still kind of felt like the food safety systems caught it, and not realizing that the warning system was pets and people were dying. That's not a very good proactive early warning system, but there's kind of this feel that it was addressed. Also, I think there was a challenge where a lot of the, like, let's say, food authenticity scientists and labs said, well, we've done as much as we can. It's someone else's job to understand criminology or the supply chain or business decision making. But there was no one on the other end of it to catch it. So there was a lot of people testing for melamine, but not much else. Then in 2012 was horse meat and beef. And this occurred right during when the Global Food Safety Initiative, GFSI, had a food fraud think tank. And I was one of 4 people on it. It grew to 6 people, giving the board of GFSI insight. And at first the question was, what is food fraud? And then later, what should GFSI do about it? Should it be a part of a food safety management system? Well, there was a lot of concern because when melamine was infant formula and pet food, then the question was, what else could be in there? You don't test for every single thing on the planet, but every single thing on the planet could cause a global recall, could cause deaths and problems with products. And so when horse meat occurred, it really raised the intensity of the focus. And GFSI said, look, we got to do something, because food fraud is a root cause of a food safety incident. Now, very low likelihood compared to E. coli, salmonella, aflatoxin, whatever, very low, but still it's a root cause. And GFSI ultimately, like Vassap, is a quality management system. It's not just a wait to respond to the top 10 worst things. It's looking at root causes and trying to control those. So that really led it to action. And GFSI, they had a position paper on food fraud that came out, and then they had a statement of what was going to be in the next food safety standards. And that's really the spark of why we got where we are. Now, later, things kept happening. So I don't know if you remember even back, it seems so long ago now, the Brazilian beef fraud. That was where there's some up-labeling of product by the certifications and things. So the quality level. And then really we've had ongoing. The key now is that food fraud is a defined concept. And so it shows up. And if you do an internet search on news, you'll start to see some type of activities classified as food fraud. Or more importantly is like the EU has a really big focus on it, has a work group on food fraud. They release reports and updates on it. Interpol and Europol have Operation Opsin, which was food crime at the start, really looking at counterfeiting, and now it's really all fraud. So the word fraud is being used, food fraud is being used a lot. And it makes sense, as we'll get into. So now from the ag side of it, I've started to add these in to look at what occurs, things like on the farm. And because a lot of times people thought, well, this is just in the marketplace. Well, we just sell our product to the manufacturer sells it, and something happens outside. But these are known organic fraud incidents since 2002. So that's not that long ago. Organic fertilizer scheme. So spike nitrogen fertilizer, and they were sentenced. So the key there is that, you know, you're putting this on, this is an agriculture side of things, not just a food side of it. So that fertilizer you're using could then, you know, could end up lead to at least mislabeling, but could be, you know, if it's organic, that's not organic, is fraud, and that's mislabeled. 200 tons of conventionally grown corn sold as organic. Now I think with some of these people, they like maybe accidentally ship one load that's not what it is supposed to be, and oh, well, no one kind of caught it. It just happened once, but all of a sudden they made a lot of money in the difference between the conventional and organic. And I think it's like a gambler, you know, just a little bit, and some people just keep going, or there's financial stress, and they have to start to cut corners, and then you get going, and then I think sometimes a lot of criminals think, well, I'm already a criminal, you know, I can't get much worse. So if I did 100 tons, well, what's 200 tons? But that's an awful lot of product that can cause a lot of problems with the supply chain. These are very, very early on, you know, raw agricultural materials. Another fertilizer business, soybeans, non-organic from Ukraine. So that's international. And look at this. A lot of times people think it's all international, but look at these. These are U.S. based. These are domestic. One thing with that is it's within the borders, so there's not customs monitoring it. There's not that type of documentation or checkpoint. A lot of fraud occurs within domestic borders because that a little bit of less oversight, or if it's between states, something happens in one state, it's kind of moved over. And look at this last one, Missouri and Iowa. So 140 million conventional corn sold as organic. So you'll see a couple of these are pretty consistent. Fertilizers, types of basic feed, or you know, these most basic raw materials that have some type of statement to them. So it's definitely happening out there, and it's definitely causing lots and lots of problems. It's causing lots and lots of problems and stress for state departments of agriculture and rural development, because these are the activities that we're supposed to be supporting. So it's out there. So before kind of digging into what we do, I'm trying to still convince you or give some evidence, the background of what it is that we need to do. So from a company standpoint, first off, there's the GFSI. And now people would say, well, I'm not GFSI certified, I'm by FSSC or something. Well, the key is GFSI is the core base. And that's the requirement. And then the food safety standards, FSSC, SQF, BRC, IFS, and others, they are based on GFSI, and they seek GFSI endorsement that they're covered. So as of January 2018, this was required in the food safety standard for GFSI. And GFSI represents approximately 65% of the world trade, their members. So, but the key is most of them are at the end of the supply chain. So if every grocery store in the country essentially requires a food safety management system, all their suppliers need to have some type of food safety system. So GFSI is really significant because of that. They require a food fraud vulnerability assessment. So that's looking at that assessment, that it's documented, and they require a prevention strategy for all products, not just raw agricultural materials coming in, not just ingredients coming in, for all products. Because say you're the grocery store, they need to just buy those cookies, and they don't, if it's got your brand on it, it needs to be what it is. So GFSI looks holistically at everything, because that's the way bad guys look at it, and that's where the risks are. If we only look at pieces of it, we'll only protect part of the supply chain. Let's say that you're going to go out on vacation to Florida in the sun, and you put sunscreen on half your body, not the other half. So great, you've got SPF 100 on this arm, but nothing on the other. Well, that's great that this arm is safe, but your other arm is going to burn to a crisp. You know, you could have a lot of problems. And that's if you don't address all types of fraud. It's like putting a sunscreen on just half your body. You know, I'm gonna have to remember that. That's actually a pretty good analogy. A key here with GFSI is no documents equals no audit nonconformance. Because if I'm auditing you and I say, well, do you have a strategy? Yes. Can I read it? No. Well, I don't have anything to judge if you've actually done it. It's just hearsay. And then also really a key is no certifications, no sales, or at least a lot of explaining. Think if you lose your food safety certification because of food fraud, then well, you lost your food safety certification. So that's a key that is required of industry. If you're the government agency looking at this, if someone is GFSI, if someone has a food safety management system and it's certified to GFSI, these are all documents that they must have. So if you ask them to see their food fraud vulnerability assessment or their prevention strategy, or if you're a supplier, if you're a customer asking your supplier, these are all things they're supposed to have. So you're not asking them to reinvent the wheel or build a rocket ship to the moon. These are all things that should be in place. Now let's go back a little bit. Preventive controls, September 2016, this was required. So some people say, well, GFSI is really still rolling out. Well, it's not supposed to be. And if you got away with it, then your auditors aren't really doing their job so far. But 2016. So it says a hazard analysis must be written regardless of its outcome. So that doesn't say only hazards that are really bad need to have an analysis. You can't justify that something's not a hazard unless you've done an analysis. You have to do an analysis to show and demonstrate that you've looked at it and it is low. And people will say, well, it doesn't include food fraud, but not so fast. Here's the section that says a hazard may be intentionally introduced for the purposes of economic gain. Now, it doesn't say a substance was added, it says a hazard. So mishandling also could count as a hazard. Stolen goods being inserted. So the bottom line is that analysis is required. Now, you might not have to do a lot. This doesn't say 10 pages or 10 hours or 100 hours or 1,000 hours or 1,000 data points. It just says the hazard analysis. So, but it is required, which is the key at the start. And really, if you look back, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, all types of food fraud have been illegal in one way or another, at least since 1938, because that would fall under adulterated foods or misbranded foods. So bottom line, we are supposed to have been doing this. Now, for companies, public companies, is Sarbanes-Oxley Act. This is financial reporting. This requires looking at all risks to the business. And if you're not a public company, these general concepts do apply. The people that give you money, either the owners, shareholders, the bank, they still are looking for you to have some type of management systems in place. And the bottom line now is customers, the retailers and the food manufacturers expect supplier quality and safety expectations there. So all of this is really required. And again, if someone has a food safety standard, certification, then they should already have these in place and be able to show them to you very quickly. Definitions, just for reference, real quick, but I wanted to make sure these are in here. Food quality is unintended variation that doesn't have a health hazard. Food safety is unintentional, but it has a health hazard. Food fraud, I'll go into detail later, but a key then, food defense is different. Food defense is intentional act with the intent to harm, economic, public health, or terror. So food fraud and food defense are both intentional, but their motivation is fundamentally different. And with food defense, the bad guys they want people to know that there's a problem. With food fraud, they're sneaking around. They're trying to find a way around our system. So that's one reason why things like Sudan red or melamine or horse meat could sneak in and be in for a long time, because the bad guys are good at sneaking around. Food defense, the IA. So generally, like under GFSI, food defense is all intents to harm. The intentional adulteration rule from FSMA narrows the focus to wide-scale human health harms. And a key with that is that that's not all types of defense of the product, like tampering in the store, disgruntled employees don't fit under that. So if a company is compliant with IA, great. That's great. That's important. But that doesn't mean they're compliant with all food defense requirements, even within FSMA and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. They're only compliant to that narrow part of the rule that's wide-scale harms. Just to remind everybody, food security. Now, if you come from another industry, product security is protecting the product from any harms at all. That's not the case in the food industry. Food security is safe, nutritious, continuous economic supply of food. So it's the supply of food. Having food security means you have enough food to eat, and food insecurity is you don't have enough food. So how am I doing? Donna and others, sound good and pace is good?
Yes, it sounds very good. Pace is great.
All right, it's good. Just, it's so weird.
Yeah, to have some feedback.
Yeah. So yeah, it's because if we're there in live person, we can see each other. So I'll say that my wife sometimes thinks it's really funny. I'll do these hour-long or sometimes even 4-hour-long training sessions. So there I am in my office by myself, just talking to myself. So, one little story about that. So when the MOOCs are 2 2-hour webinars, that's 4 hours long. Sometimes they go longer. And so that's me recording like this, in front of a laptop camera usually. And my wife said that the second MOOC I did was much better and engaging than the first. Well, that makes sense. First to second, you're more familiar. But I realized that what happened, so I'm there in the room by myself, and I realized that my colleague's daughter had come into the office over the weekends while he was working, and she drew on the whiteboard a bunch of stick people and princesses and dragons and knights and all sorts of stuff. So people were on the board. I realized when I was presenting, I started to look at those stick figures on the whiteboard, and that led me to be a little more engaged. But anyway, so it's good to get a little feedback. So again, so what we'll hit here is then now this food fraud prevention. Again, we're trying to dig in to give you a little bit of background. So if you're inspecting, getting inspected, putting these plans together for yourself, you've got a foundation. Also, again, the video resource for your group. So a quick review of food fraud prevention. How much, how deep, and what is the goal? And the goal is to help small and medium-sized, well, in this, I was focused previously on dairy businesses, but businesses understand and begin addressing the food fraud prevention compliance requirements. This is the very basics at the start. This works for small companies. You don't have to have a lot of people. Now, with a big company, maybe they do have someone who a quarter of their job, half their job, all their job is food fraud prevention. But as a small company, there's a lot of these resources where you can, attend a short workshop. We just did one with Wisconsin dairy industry, and it can really help people get up to speed pretty quickly. So first off, definition: intentional deception for economic gain using food. That's any deception using any part of the food. And again, like I said about the sunscreen on one arm, not the other, we need to look at all fraud because that's the way the bad guys look at it. That sun's is not trying to burn you, but you're going to get burned some way if you don't pay attention. And the bad guys are going to find a way around some things that we do. Now, that definition is consistent really worldwide. Now, in the US, you might be more familiar with economically motivated adulteration, EMA. And FDA has a working definition they still use is a substance for economic gain, an adulterant substance. So this is a subcategory of food fraud. Some people used to use EMA as a broad term for this, but really when we look at the FDA specifically, they identify it only as a substance. And so if you are being regulated by somebody, it's best to use their definition. So it's a subcategory. The motivation is economic gain for yourself. So if I were to put glass shards in the product to harm my company or something, then I'd be trying to harm somebody else. And again, I mentioned earlier about food defense and FSMA, that you can be IA compliant, but not compliant with all the food defense areas. That's a real key, that motivation. The motivation is what we can focus on to reduce the fraud opportunity because these are criminals. They're trying to make money and they don't want to get caught. There's always an effect, but there's always an economic threat, but there's not always a public health threat. And that's one reason why this hadn't been worked on really in great detail because, something pops up, it's a problem, then it goes away. Melamine comes up and it goes away. Well, then the people working on the public health aspect of it say, well, it's not us anymore. Send it over to criminal investigation. And criminal investigation, FBI, deals with the things that go boom. And kidnappings. That's what we want them to be working on. And when there's these really complex cases of commercial fraud, it's really hard for that to be prioritized over, again, things that go boom. What then at some point, though, especially during horse meat, is industry said, look, we got to do something because this vulnerability is really bad. We need to work on it. We can't just wait for the threats to pop up and deal with them one off. And that's where everything really came together. And that's why we focus on vulnerabilities. So keep that in the back of your mind, the concept of vulnerability. So the food risk matrix. What happened, how this was developed is originally we were dealing in food safety and food defense, and we started to talk a little bit about food fraud. And we found that it was really fundamentally different when we're looking at the root cause. Again, food defense, we find out what goes on because if the bad guys are good at it, that we find out. And food safety is obviously something we know about. And then we include food quality in here because these are usually really essentially quality management systems. Plan, do, check, act, looking at root causes, having processes in place. And for food quality and food safety, the action is unintentional. We don't try to create these. For food defense and food fraud, it's intentional. We're not doing it, but the bad guys are intentional. For food defense, their goal is public health, or harm, public health, economic, or terror. And the motivation for food fraud is economic gain for themselves. That's where we really have this break, where we can look at system weaknesses and start to try to figure out how we can make it less attractive, make that economic gain less. And again, just as a reminder, again, about the fourth time I've said it, is wide-scale harms, or the IA rule, is a subcategory of food defense. It's really important to be IA compliant, but there's a lot more to food defense than just IA. So what is food fraud? This is defined by GFSI. It's looking at all the root causes. The bottom line is the bad guys are looking at for any way to commit fraud. And if you start to do a lot of melamine and horse meat testing, then they're going to go to some other chemical and some other animal, to other species in there. Now the bad guys are looking for opportunities. So there might not be an opportunity. You might, however your system is put together, it might be inherently low vulnerability. But when they see that ability to cut corners, they're going to do it. There's going to be opportunity. So food fraud covers a lot of areas. Now at the top here is where FDA and public health agencies focus, because this is where usually the public health problems will reside. But these other areas are still important, can lead to illegal product, misbranded, tampering, mislabeling, overruns, counterfeiting, gray market theft and diversion. So stolen goods are smuggled. There's a section in FSMA on smuggled food, and it's a requirement, but not many people know about it. But if the food has been smuggled in the country, it's illegal. It's misbranded, it's adulterated, it's unfit for commerce. Even though it might be perfectly fine, maybe it doesn't make anybody sick, the bottom line is it's still illegal. That's why we cover all types of fraud. And that's why the focus overall for the UK, EU, GFSI, China, ISO, and really the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act is all types of fraud, because that's the root cause. But all of a sudden we say, well, what can we do? We're food scientists, we're food inspectors. We're looking at this. How can we deal with these other things? Well, the bottom line is that we all have a different role to play. And that's where we look at things like GFSI for direction of how companies should act. So I'm not going to go into details on this, but there's a lot of types of product fraud, and there's a lot of definitions to help you with that. So that's just a part of the deck. So we've got these incidents, we've got these requirements. We know that it's all these different types of fraud. How do we deal with this? How do we put this together? Well, that's exactly what a GFSI type system, an organization, is supposed to do. That's why GFSI created the think tank to try to put this together. So we'll dig into this a little bit to get to those details. So first off, if you don't know GFSI has these recognized schemes, and they call them now certification program owners or certification programs. So this food safety management scheme is recognized. So GFSI will review it, or be asked to review, and then it'll be recognized when it meets that internationally recognized minimum standard food safety requirements and that are set out in the GFSI guidance document. So it's really, really clear there. And GFSI is not a standard or scheme itself, and GFSI doesn't carry out any of the accreditation or certification activities. That is the certification program owners. So these specific standards apply to different businesses, and they're then called, like the ones down below are GFSI recognized schemes, and then they're run by a certification program. So like I say down here, here's IFS. So they're a certification program. They have standards. They're the certification program owner, and they're certified by a certification body. So IFS will recognize certain companies that understand their system and are certified and by them to do these activities. They're the CBs, certification body, or like auditors. And then the CPO, the certification program, recognizes certain CBs to operate. And then food fraud is required after January 2018. Now you could say, is that quick or slow as we've been moving along? It depends on your perspective. Ultimately, it's really very fast. Think about the beginning of food safety. How did that go from being a new idea to something that was required everywhere? And so ultimately, food fraud prevention is moving very quickly, but really probably not quick enough for protecting the food supply chain. But we're moving. And GFSI does not identify mandatory sections. All are required. So people can say, well, food fraud is not a part of food safety. We're not compliant with that, but we're compliant with everything else. The bottom line is with GFSI is you're either GFSI compliant or you're not. And GFSI includes all these areas, including food fraud, including food defense, to be addressed, or you get a no. So GFSI, just real briefly, how it happened and what it is. So at the very beginning, the consumer, there was a lot of regulations in the food industry. And, you know, if you were across Europe, you probably had 10 different HACCP plans for Dutch HACCP, German HACCP, whatever. And the Consumer Goods Forum, which is a group of 350 global CEOs, said, hey, this is crazy. Let's try to create our own activity, some type of summary. So the Consumer Goods Forum created GFSI. This is companies, it's created by companies to manage companies, to meet regulations. Let's get started on that. So they developed it, and that's the idea. That's the concept. And then other companies, those scheme owners, the certification programs, they create the standard. And then companies, food companies, do it. They implement it. And then the certification body gets confirmed. And there's a list of some of them there that are kind of familiar. Now you see a process started, but if you know me, I like cycles and continuous activities. So bottom line is then along the way, governments require a process. So let's say you're the New York State Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. Then the key there is to remind people that addressing all types of food fraud and FSMA and Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act areas are required, and just to require a process. But you don't need to define the specific process. Let the companies kind of prove it to you. But the key is they're already doing it for food, for the GFSI requirements. So you're not asking them to do the impossible. You're not asking them to reinvent the wheel or develop a rocket ship to the moon. You're just confirming that they have in place what they should be having in place. That then leads back to doing what it's supposed to do. Governments is to make sure that the marketplace, society, is as safe as possible with it, or at whatever levels. And then that really does support the regulations. So governments could have a very little bit of activity down here, but have a tremendous impact, and that's a real key. So GFSI at the very beginning with the think tank, as you'll see, presented in 2014, is really we needed to define different work processes. So this is the GFSI umbrella, and I love the umbrella concept. There's all these activities under food safety, under the concept of quality management systems to protect the food supply chain. And so what we've got here is food safety is HACCP, hazard analysis. We know that's been out there. And GFSI requires a separate assessment for food defense and food fraud. For food defense, there are threats that will cause harm. So that's TACCP, threat assessment. And for food fraud, it's vulnerabilities. And a hazard and a threat and a vulnerability are a little bit different. And they're specifically effective when you're looking at these types of problems. So HACCP, TACCP, and Vassap. Now, a key to that is there's a name for each of them. So like an auditor going into a company can say, hey, show me your TACCP. Or a customer, say a food company that's a customer, can go to their suppliers and ask for Vassap information on Vassap. So HACCP, TACCP, and Vassap are really pretty simple ways to look at this. So this idea of Vassap is not novel. It's not something completely out of the blue that GFSI made up to make the world more difficult. Really, and this at the very beginning, this is like part of my role as an academic, is to look at the background. Look at everything that's been going on. So the idea of Vassap really it's an evolution of common concepts. And it just has been refined in a way to a pretty simple system, ultimately, that meets a lot of really very different requirements. At the very beginning, we had HACCP, and it grew out of HACCP. And so think about your HACCP plan, how you document it, meeting minutes, things like that. This is HACCP, but for food fraud. So it built out of that. And HACCP, it was basically ISO 22000 and others. And then ISO 22000, the basic concepts in international standards are quality management, that's ISO 9000, 31000 is risk management, and Six Sigma is really a more commercial application, how companies apply this. So it's basic risk management. So the terms are the same, it builds upon that, it's consistent with those requirements. And then we've got other ISO standards around product fraud. So there's already been a lot of activity. I was involved. I was the founder, the founding chair of the first technical committee on product fraud for the U.S. And those built out, and we've applied them here. Then you've got the food regulations, again, like FSMA, Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, things from around the world, import laws, and then also tying in the enterprise risk financial reporting, because again, all public companies need to do this type of reporting. If we just at the very beginning define the assessment that we're doing for food fraud, and it aligns with the needs all the way up to the financial reporting into the board of directors, then we just have an efficient system at the start. We'll have a little less rework. So that's a key, that it's not new, and hopefully giving you the confidence that if you just start to do it, it's going to apply and sync up with all these other activities. And then the key is looking at a couple requirements. And so the first one is food fraud vulnerability assessment. So again, if say you're an auditor, inspector, or you're looking at your suppliers, if your suppliers say they're GFSI compliant, they should have these documents. They're required. So to take the vulnerability assessment, and you'll see the chart there, a heat map of the problems. And we recommend you create a one-page document, because if I'm the auditor and I say, hey, can you send it to me? Or your customer asks, you already have this approved and written up and in a nice format. I've seen sometimes people get stressed at that point to say, well, pull it up, show me what you got. And it's a draft format with even like odd notes, like this doesn't make sense, or how do we do this? But you want to have a refined document. And again, if your supplier says they're GFSI compliant, if you're doing an audit, an inspection, and someone says they're GFSI compliant, they should be able to pull this up really, really quickly. Also, a prevention strategy and a one-page summary of how they're going to implement things. This is really the most efficient way to move forward. And so those are the requirements that we've got that are out there. So that's the basics. So Don, I'll just double check again. Everything good from your end?
Yep, we're doing good. We've got, we're scheduled to go through 11:30 when we'll open up for question and answers. So let's keep going. Sounds great.
Gotcha. All right. Well, I'm going to throw some bonus before going back to the final requirements for food fraud. I'm going to do this bonus content. I was going to try to make that slide kind of flash, but I'm not that tech savvy, I guess. But so cybersecurity and e-commerce has an important part here, because think about what's happened this last year. Every company has an app. Our convenience store on the corner has an app and has curbside pickup. It's actually great. You pull in and they see it. You don't have to even check in. They see you when you're there. Or some people even have like license plate readers that alert them who's there. So e-commerce has really been a question, and FDA is starting to ask some questions about that. So it's good that we look at this just real quickly. And I think as the state of New York, you may have some questions as well. So this is a good foundation. And then we'll look at the combination of food fraud and the related cybersecurity e-commerce content before looking at the real call to action. So in my book, we have a chapter on cybersecurity and ISO 22000. So please, it's a Google Doc that's editable. A lot of people have actually gave comments already. So take a look at what we've got started, and then you can help us lead the direction. If there's other questions you have, let's say that you are either a company or a standard or an agency, and you're being asked questions, let us know early on. We can still get those in the book. So I went back and looked at what are the requirements for food safety. Now, if we look at the preventive controls rule, way back when, its hazard analysis must be written regardless of its outcome. Cybersecurity would fit in that. And is it explicitly or implicitly? It's not explicitly in there. It doesn't say cybersecurity or e-commerce, but it's actually really in there, because if it's a hazard, it must be assessed. Oh, we just got through trying to figure out food fraud. Now we got to add this to it. Well, the bottom line, it is a hazard, and we need to move forward. So how would we look at this? Another reason why you should look at this sooner rather than later is the FDA, under the new era of smarter food safety blueprint, has an e-commerce meeting coming up, and they're going to ask us as industry what we think and what we need and what are the risks. FDA is taking a very proactive first step aligned with standards such as risk management, doing incident review, looking at supply chain mapping, and they're following the ISO 9000 quality management and food safety management concepts. And the first part is to gather that incident information. So real key is to, be able to let them know what type of incidents we should be looking at or not. A lot of times there's these vulnerabilities or uncertainties, but they're not causing a health consequence or a problem. But we need to really look at it to understand that, to do the hazard analysis, remember? And a key start is the supply chain mapping. And that's something from my work in supply chain management is we have students constantly mapping supply chains to see exactly where product comes from, where it goes, and really who handles the products. That's the big deal with now e-commerce or the direct to consumer. It's one thing if it's curbside pickup and it's a grocery store that holds it and puts it in your car. It's another if someone's delivering it, or if it's even shipped through the mail somehow or some other type of entity. And actually, there's a lot of other areas that we can look at, such as hotspot analysis. Once you see the supply chain, and that's something we actually included in that USDA training. So there's a lot out there. I think it's really great and important, very efficient that FDA is saying, hey, let's get together and talk about this. Help us, FDA, frame the concept before we start looking at how we need to act. And again, the very basic is that incident review, actual incidents that have occurred, and then doing that supply chain mapping to look at the system weaknesses. So how does that help us? We'll step back and look at what's already out there and what's required. So this is ISO 22000, food safety management, and I have observer status, so I'm on the emails and can contribute. I'm not a voting member, but observer, so I've seen this evolved over time. The key with the food safety management overall, and this is back to, this should seem very, if I've done my job, it seems completely logical at this point, but the key is overall food safety management is to prevent hazards or reduce hazards to acceptable levels. That could include e-commerce, could include food fraud, but it's not explicitly included there. But then when we look at it, what is the cybersecurity requirement for ISO? And the scope includes anything that could lead to a food safety hazard or adverse health effect. And in there, it does mention external and internal issues. Now, key with that is you think incoming goods, and you're only thinking up the supply chain, but this includes delivery. This includes that direct to consumer piece, even though a lot of times we're only focused on the upstream side of it. And then there's a note that was added most recently. And then it says, understanding context can be facilitated by considering external including cybersecurity and food fraud. So the reason why we expanded into look at cybersecurity is let's look at this. My mother was a grammar school, a primary school grammar teacher. And she would say that this then says the combined concept of cybersecurity and food fraud. That's not two concepts. And look here, it's and, there's no comma. And if they meant for this to be two different things, there'd be comma and no and. Or maybe they didn't look at it that much. The bottom line is we need to then look in to see what's the requirement here. It's clearly stated, you must deal with this. Is not saying it's optional. It says this standard applies to these concepts. So, and what, again, is it together, only e-commerce, or is it food fraud? It's really in application, we need to look at both, but we'll dig into that. So when we look at this, that's the only place that cybersecurity or food fraud is mentioned in that standard. There's no further details or explicit compliance requirements. ISO 22000 does not have a definition of cybersecurity or food fraud, for that matter. And now there are other standards like supply chain security, and that doesn't even mention cybersecurity. The GFSI document does not mention cybersecurity. So what now? Do you get to ignore it? Well, let's look at insight from other places where cybersecurity is mentioned in the international standards. So it's ISO is one thing, so we can understand how other areas in ISO have dealt with it to help us understand what that term means and what our requirements are. So digging in further, deeper, is there is a standard on cybersecurity. There's actually a couple coming out more on e-commerce that are still under review and evolving, but those aren't published yet. So those aren't really good to talk about yet till we know what they really say. But here's this ISO 27032 on cybersecurity. So what it states there is really this emphasis on collaboration. It's not just the job of the IT department. A lot of people think, oh, my computer crashed because of a virus. Here, take it, go deal with it. Now, it's one thing for if it's just a laptop. It's another if it's your entire, food operation. So a key is collaboration. And a couple the key concepts there are information security. So that's protecting consumer information, recipes, things like that. Network security. This is access to your computers. That's like if someone opens up a spam email and some type of malware gets in or something like that. That's protecting the network from attacks. Internet security. Now, so the network is your internal systems from attacks. So like someone gets into an email and the email goes to your HR system. That's your network. Information security are the databases. Again, like customer information, credit card information. Internet security is when your company's interacting out on the internet. So information's flowing, you're getting information, you're emailing other people, you're searching for information, you're watching this webinar. Your company would have internet security features there. Now, if you're the food safety manager, you don't have a lot of experience in those areas. You don't have a cybersecurity and IT degree. You don't study that. You don't write code, and you're not supposed to. But the role you have in this collaboration is critical information infrastructure protection, or really the critical infrastructure protection. The key with this is it's you talking with the IT team to say, here's what I'm worried about. It might be like a metal detector or a temperature check that the internal temperature got to a certain level. You've got some key activities and really that critical infrastructure. So you could say these two computers are the most important for us. And then that leads the IT cyber team can then look at the systems, taking everything they know about your whole company. They can take that then to understand if your system is protected. And again, they're doing this for 100 other systems. If you try to just protect those two systems yourself, you'd have to go learn basic cybersecurity. That really does make no sense, or it's inefficient. And it's the CIIP is different than CIP. It's about the information you have versus the machinery and things, but they're really very similar. It's your expertise sharing with them. And then if you're not an expert in IT or cybersecurity, and they're not experts in food safety and food manufacturing operations, that's where you come together. That's the role of the food safety manager in finding and working and supporting the bigger IT group. It's not selecting antivirus software or buying new systems. That is not efficient for us to be doing that. In fact, it could be dangerous because a little bit of knowledge is more dangerous than none, because you might think that you're completely protecting your computer. I'll give you an example of me, and I'll call myself out. So my computer got really slow. It was about 10 years ago, and I took it into the Geek Squad at Best Buy, and I had like over 1,000 malware programs running on my computer. And I said, what is going on here? Because I do the antivirus software every week at least. I manually do it, like before I whatever. And the thing that they said, I never did the live update. So basically, you get the notice to do what usually it runs in the background, that it updates all those patches and links and updates, sometimes hourly, if there's something that comes out. I never updated it. I didn't know that. I didn't know that wasn't doing it. And that's the danger, that I was not an expert in IT. And I thought I was doing everything right. I was doing the daily, weekly, running of the antivirus, but I missed the critical step of adding those updates. Now I know what that problem is, and now I also go take it into the computer store more often to make sure I'm doing everything right. That's a real key for us. So call to action for cybersecurity, and it's a big deal. And it's out there, and there's going to be a lot of push about this. There's going to be a lot more, I think, in the next year about it. The FDA work is looking more at e-commerce and that direct-to-consumer food safety, but there's going to be a lot about cybersecurity. So we were asked to really drill down to that call to action based on the best practices of those ISO standards and others. So a key is accountable versus responsible. You're accountable. You are accountable to confirm your company meets ISO 22000. That's external. So when you have that requirement, so you as a food safety manager need to look at your system and say, well, am I comfortable that our IT cybersecurity team is protecting us? That's what you're accountable for. You're not accountable for doing the assessments and selecting countermeasures. You're accountable for explaining to IT and cyber your critical information infrastructure risks. You're an expert in your area, and you're an expert in ISO 22000. Now, the responsible side of that, the cyber team is tasked with selecting and implementing the processes across the entire enterprise. Now, this leads to harmonized and coordinated approach, and it really levels the enterprise-wide risk tolerance, being that they're experts in the area and they're looking at 100 systems, not just the food safety system or the 2 systems you have. They're looking at everything, and they're figuring out the best ways to protect. So maybe there's something that's really a low risk, low vulnerability for you, and it's really high for the transportation department. Well, they'll still implement that with you, and that just protects you even more. You are responsible that your team follows the IT and cybersecurity requirements such as updates or training or other, such as if you replace the computer, if you have an emergency and you have to replace the computer that runs your metal detector. It's maybe you did run out to the store to get it because you're trying to just do the production run, but it's your job to make sure that you then follow up and make sure that you've got compliant systems and systems that they have in their system, so they're tracking it, and also to make sure your employees know it's serious to consider cybersecurity. So from all these other standards, they're stating that you, as the CIP area expert, you're not accountable or responsible for conducting the security assessments or selecting, implementing, and managing those systems. You are accountable for being a part of the process and letting them know their problems. That seemed maybe kind of intense for me to go through, but it's been, like I said, the last 2 months or so, a lot of companies have had a lot of challenges. A lot of individuals have been really challenged by what they should be doing, and kind of led in a direction of trying to do some of these things that were really not the thing for them to do. So this is trying to help you understand what you're accountable for and what you're not. So Don, I'll just do a process check there, I think, just to double check.
We're still here. Thank you.
All right. So now we're going to get down to the kind of the couple of the key concepts for you. I thought about this. We covered a lot of what companies should do, or auditors, inspectors, but I think I really like the opportunity to lay out the role of the government or agencies in food fraud prevention. I think that this is something that's not been burning, but burning too much on people's agenda. But then if you look at those like organic ag threats, the modern incidents that I showed before, that's getting a lot of attention. You know, that's causing a lot of stress across the market and in the world. And people like the USDA National Organic Program are taking a lot of very proactive steps because there's a really heightened awareness. This can undercut entire markets if there's a lack of trust. I think also if we see an incident like a horse meat occurring, some type of fraud, then that could really raise the focus to say, you know, who should be looking at this. So we're still, you know, in the midst of trying to get the public health aspects of COVID under control and assurance of supply, enough product in the shelves. But I think this is really going to be out there. So I think it's good to at least review, so you've got it, got a concept there to think about. So what are the rules? So overall, for those concepts, we had our paper up there. You'll see that the citation. So at the very beginning, the first concept is to formally and specifically mention food fraud as a food safety issue. Now, that doesn't mean a new law or regulation. Usually this is illegal one way or another someplace in a law for a state or a government. But it's to have a statement and possibly a web page, you know, that says that's on food fraud and reminds people of that. Concept 2 is to create a government-wide food fraud prevention plan. So it's one thing to chase issues. It's another to really look at the, to have an actual plan. I'm working with Interpol Operation Opsin. So November, I'll be with, right now, 110 governments are there. I don't know how many there are. Well, 110 attendees, probably 50 something governments. And they're looking at how to do their government-wide assessments. The key there is that you can't say you're working on the top problems unless you've done an assessment. And that's the key to figure out what are the biggest risks and vulnerabilities. So these are the first 2 concepts. But when we wrote this paper, people kept saying, well, we need more. We don't know, you know, it's not helping us. Actually, those are great concepts in theory, but what do we actually do? So the first is this idea of this clarification. Nothing's new here, but if you had a food fraud statement, a web page, something like that, and what we actually put in the paper, this was actually written for an agency that we had been talking to. So this statement confirms that agency. What are you? The well, we'd be Ingham County Board of Health. Expects the food industry to conduct risk or vulnerability assessments, of course, including mitigation or prevention plans where warranted on all incidents that could lead to a health hazard or violation of a food law such as FSMA, Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. This, it's supposed to be this, includes all food fraud such as adulterant substances. It lists the types, so you're clear. It does include counterfeiting, mislabeling, gray market theft and diversion. You're clarifying it. And it's consistent with existing federal and state laws and regulations. So you're not saying this is not something new. This is just a reminder. And third-party certifications play an important role. And the key there is that when you're looking at this, you're stating clearly what's supposed to be in there, that it's already a law, it's nothing new, and there's the types that are included. And this is really just clarifying what is supposed to be in place already. And so again, it's not any new law or regulation, it just clarifies for people. And again, if you have some type of statement on a website, just have this have a tab for food fraud and this as a statement, then you could list the types of laws and regulations below it. And that'll go a long way because you're now clarifying to people that this is something that is important. And like FDA having that meeting on e-commerce, the business to consumer, they're stating that they're looking at it. Now, all they're saying is they're gathering information, but the bottom line is FDA is looking at this. Inside your company, it's something you should deal with. And then policy of really where to start. This was the second article. This came from actually sitting in the back of a conference with someone head of food fraud for a European government. And so we looked at what could really happen right away. So real simple. So say you've got that one-page summary for your state, and the state could start by conducting a survey. Just wondering, it's just regarding compliance. Hey, do you have a vulnerability assessment? Have you considered food fraud? And by you just asking the questions is an emphasis that you're looking at it. So even just formally surveying the industry would raise awareness of the issue. The results of the non-compliance survey could be data used for prioritizing regular food safety inspections. So if you just ask someone, hey, do you have a food safety management system? Which system? Is it IFS, BRC? Who did the audit? That's all public information. Those are things that can help you prioritize and look at where there might be risks in the systems. And then just formally surveying the industry would raise the awareness of that issue. Such as, do you follow a food fraud standard or certification? Which one? There's nothing crazy there, and they could opt out of it. Do you have a food fraud audits that certify your operations? Who conducts those? You're just asking a question. And then you can consider those as you're moving forward. Again, this would emphasize you're just starting to look at it, and it could be an issue. And that's important at the very start. So call to action. One second. I like to try to boil it down after all this. And so what we've got here is really overall for companies or government agencies, because we're looking at the same problem from the other side. Define your specific compliance requirements. So if you're the state, then you're saying which state laws, which federal laws you're following, FSMA, Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, but think about other laws that are in place. Import laws. So, New York has a border with Canada. So what are the expectations there? What are other laws that could be in place? And you're just reminding people what it might be outside your agency specifically, but those are actual laws. Those laws could lead the product to be illegal, unfit for commerce, which would fall under a food and ag department. Identify actual incidents and known vulnerabilities. Two different things there. Some people say, oh, cybersecurity for food, it could be terrible. There could be these attacks, this and that and the other. And when we go to look for actual incidents, they're very hard to find in some cases. And what we want to do is we want to understand which specific incidents have occurred and why did they occur. And we can see a lot of those are system weaknesses, like employees respond to spam and something happens there. So we look at the specific incidents. There have been some that have led to public health threats, whether they were intentional or not. Still, we can look at those actual incidents. And then known vulnerabilities. So to then be worried about that critical infrastructure, which piece of equipment could be a problem if something went wrong. Now, it might be, I mean, there's a cyber attack that's intentional to get in. That's food defense, where someone's trying to unplug the metal detector so that you are harmed or consumers eat product that has metal in there. Now, I might ask a question: if there's such big pieces of metal that can cause a lot of harm, you've probably got some maintenance problems going on. But still, the other side of that is more quality management, that you just don't have good systems where the computer can go off the rails. So that's looking at those vulnerabilities. Gather insight and guidance on how to start and how much is enough, like attending this session. So we're trying to lay that out, and we'll have a lot more on cybersecurity later. We obviously have a lot on food fraud. So as you start to address it and you've looked at your incidents, vulnerabilities, look at really the best practices that are out there. You may not, just because you don't know of a lot of training or resource doesn't mean it's not out there. So just go look a little bit. Do not reinvent the wheel. Most likely someone else has done some of this before. Seek training on the overviews before starting. So don't just start gathering information. It's unbelievable with academic research. Sometimes people put in a week's worth of work, and then they go to the library and find that there was an article that covered everything. Could have been 5 minutes to take the place of that entire week. So look at what's out there and kind of build your foundation. We have those MOOCs that are free. SSafe has training videos for vulnerability assessments that are free, systems that are free. So you can see what resources are there in relation to your problem and your compliance requirement, and then you can really get your plan to move forward. It's so inefficient to start just by yourself. I had one company I went to, they had done it was for food defense. They had 800 products. They had 800 tabs on a spreadsheet. They'd done an assessment for every product that they buy. And when I looked at those, everyone was so different because they were done over the course of about a year. So processes changed. Different people did them. They considered different data information. Basically, I didn't have the heart to tell them is that none of those 800 tabs of research could be used. Now, generally, we could use them kind of in theory, but it really couldn't because they were not consistent. So don't just start doing stuff. That's really, really dangerous and a waste of time. Find a plan to meet your specific requirement. And then really to remind you of those steps: gather incidents and vulnerabilities, complete the food fraud vulnerability assessment. Now, if you're doing cyber, you could do a cyber vulnerability assessment yourself, implement that food fraud prevention strategy, develop and implement it, and then create a plan to update and manage it. Now, the key is, not necessarily to keep doing more. Maybe you have controls in place and you can do less. That's happened in a lot of situations. People are doing so much, like species tests for meat, looking horse and beef, and they're testing like every shipment that comes in. They're doing authenticity tests on every bag of ingredient that comes in. That might be important during an incident, but once the incident is past, then you shift from the detection of the known problem into prevention. And when you're looking at prevention, it's a lot less. Think about like a blood sample. For you, if you all of a sudden have a blood disease, then you go to the doctor and they're monitoring that. You might go in once a week or a couple times a week to get a blood sample to monitor your levels of whatever. Now, for me, I go in once a year for my annual review. So I go get the 3 vials of blood, whatever they take, once a year. So for me, it's just prevention. They're not looking for anything specific for a problem. They're looking generally for my blood health. So that's a key with that. If you really have a plan in place, you may be able to say, well, look, we're testing John like he's got blood cancer, and we really need to be only in prevention mode. So if you implement these plans, there might be a lot of work at the start, but once you get through it, you might actually be able to you might find and document and support that actually doing less is really efficient. So with that, I'll be ready to take some questions, just a couple minutes early for you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That was a lot of information to take in, and I really appreciate that presentation. I guess I'll remind the participants, if you want to unmute yourself you have that ability, and you
Donna?
can, yep,
I have, somebody sent me a direct question because their mic is not working. So I do have a question to start us off while
perfect.
other people form their questions or decide to unmute themselves.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, and you're welcome to either, if you're not comfortable unmuting yourself and asking, you're welcome to put that in the chat function too. Go
So
ahead,
the
Betsy.
first question is from Michelle Gorman. And again, her microphone is not working. Otherwise, she would do this herself. Are companies required to have someone identified as a food defense qualified individual? And if so, is there specific training or certification required for this individual?
Well, now food defense is a little out of the exact compliance requirements are out of my focus, but you really everything's defined there in the FSMA IA rule. And there's a lot of training. There's very specific requirements for how people are identified, and there's definitely training for that. And I would say look at the FDA's food defense website for that to identify these. What is a qualified individual? What are they qualified to do? There's a lot of different activities in there. I'm a qualified individual for doing the vulnerability assessments for food defense, but nothing more. That's the only training I got. So that's a real key to look at. What are those specific requirements? And there are some requirements.
Thank you.
So I have a question, unless there's somebody else who's in line.
There's a few in the chat.
Okay.
Do you have a recommended source for finding incidents of food fraud?
That's a great question. There's a lot out there. First off, when you say looking for incidents, you need to define what incidents you're worried about. And so let's say,
Wait, there is a follow-up from the same
Okay.
person. Do you have any specific incidences where trucking was the source of food fraud that could be used for training for drivers on why they need to follow the rules on security?
Well, actually, every once in a while, I get a call from I'll get a call from agency people every once in a while. Someone will say, hypothetically, if we saw this product in hypothetically, what would you be thinking? Well, one time it was they were inspecting a food plant, and there was a pallet of DVD movies there, like blockbuster movies, and they said, hypothetically, if we're doing an inspection of a food plant and we see a pallet of movie DVDs, what would you think? I'm thinking, well, counterfeit, right? So I'd say, definitely take a sample of that. There's no reason for a pallet of movies to be there. So I think that one of them was a call was that the back of a truck got broken into at a truck stop, and it had meat for a sub shop, and there were 2 cases of bacon that were stolen off the back of the truck. It's pre-cooked bacon. It's all, hermetically sealed. It's safe from a public health aspect. And so the question was, well, do we need to do anything? Because it's safe product. It's shelf stable, pretty much. What do we need to do? So I said, well, the bottom line is that entire truck is considered adulterated because you don't know that product's been stolen. Now, unless you can identify which lot number and which case number, if you had serialization of each case, you could then identify those 2 cases as the items that were adulterated. But you have to say every case of bacon in that lot, the entire lot, and it was a production lot, an hour or a day or a week. That entire lot is adulterated foods, unfit for commerce. So they had to go back and find it. And then what they did is they sequestered the truck. But the bottom line is to make sure to say, I think that the drivers don't need to know what food fraud is. But if you look at the vulnerability, they realized that there was that if the seals are broken, double check if anything's been stolen. And so the driver needs to look at that. Now that's just a basic business practice. But then internally, the system identified that if seals were broken, that alerts a possible fraud or adulterated foods. And then once they had the confirmation that some product was stolen, then your automatic system needs to identify that entire, sequester that entire lot. But the drivers themselves, it's kind of, you don't need to be an expert in everything in the world, but have some basic practices. But the first part of the question was how do you find out information? So if you're a sub shop that's only in the state of New York, doesn't go into any other states, and you have all this meat and you pick up the meat at a let's say a wholesaler, a big food distribution company, you pick it up and you deliver it. Are you worried about fresh Vietnamese farm-raised shrimp? No. Are you worried about European organic corn fraud? No. You have very specific interest in meats and in the company that you're dealing with and within the state of New York. So when you're looking at your own vulnerability assessments, you'd look at the data that you need for your assessment. Now, again, you don't need to know about how that food was raised because you're buying it from somebody that has supply chain controls in place. That's officially, supply chain controls is an FDA term. So the key is you figuring out what you need. Now, that being said, there are a lot of great places to look. And in the EU, there's a Vassap database that has, it's free. There's FDA import alerts, there's warnings. There's also companies out there that have information. So you can look at food, you can just look up, food fraud incident databases or food defense incidents and start to look at those. But the key is you need to know what you need before you can judge what the value of a system. Let's say it's tennis, that if you're looking for a tennis racket, that's very different if it's a tennis racket for a 5-year-old or a high school star tennis player or an old person like me. You need to know what resource should I go to buy a tennis racket? It depends on the application, but there's a lot out there. You have to define what you need first.
That's great. Here's a question from Steve Murphy. He said, nice presentation. Thanks, Steve. Perhaps you covered this, but do you have a bullet list of what a small processor would request of their suppliers regarding the suppliers' programs to prevent food fraud?
Did I have, I think that this policy question, actually, we have some other programs that do look at what to ask for from a supplier, but right here is the first couple of your, so you're asking your food supplier, do you follow a food fraud standard or certification? Which one? And who conducts your audits? That's a great start, but let's look at, so a small company, but let's look at a company that has 10,000 suppliers. How are they going to go look at this? So at the very beginning, our recommendation is that they have a survey. And so there's document management systems, there's supplier management systems. You just submit have a survey go out, are you GFSI compliant? Are you fully GFSI compliant? Does it include food fraud? Do you have a vulnerability assessment? Have you implemented a strategy? 5 questions, yes or no. And the system then identifies whether someone has answered the survey. And if they've answered yes on all 5 questions. If someone hasn't answered the survey, that doesn't mean that they're not compliant or bad, but that raises a question, right? So maybe then later you can have the system automatically, so 10,000 goes down to 5,000, still a lot. But then you could email them out to say, hey, you haven't responded to the survey. Can you please respond? That reminds them this is important. So that goes down to 1,000, goes down to 100. And at some point, you're going to have that list of 100 people who haven't really responded, and you have a list of products that you're worried about. Let's say that you're worried about tart cherries from northern Michigan, so a place where we visit quite a bit. And then you could then look at only those companies. Now, with those companies, you could then email that subset to say, okay, we're worried about your product and things. Could you please attach in our document supplier system your vulnerability assessment or a summary of it? Now, we're not looking at every one of the PDFs, but if Donna uploads the PDF when I said, this is a vulnerability assessment, at least she's made that action. Now, later we could go look at those again. We could dig deeper. So at the very start, just to ask suppliers if they're fully compliant with GFSI, and then if it includes food fraud prevention, and then if you're worried about it, you can say, well, since you already said you're compliant, could you just shoot me over, just email me, the cover page or something from your assessment. And if people haven't done it, then it spurs them to action. So I see Brian Kraus I see a hand up
Yeah.
there.
Brian, can you unmute yourself?
Got it.
Oh,
You hear
go
me?
ahead. Thank
Yes,
you.
sir.
Yes.
Hello, Dr. Spink. As usual, great information provided for us, and thanks to New York for bringing the expert like John on board. And go green, John.
Go white. Yeah. Finally.
Yeah. So we've used the CATs, key activity types, to assess vulnerability. A couple of questions with that. One, is that enough? And two, well, actually two. One, is that enough? Should we go deeper? And if we need to go deeper, do you have a tool to suggest to go a little bit further than that?
Yeah. Well, when you say key activity types, I'm thinking food defense, FSMA IA. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
That's not food fraud. So, well, and so let's say I will cover the food defense first. We have a food defense audit guide. So that's one of the MOOCs. So it'll walk you through the details of FSMA. Well, FSMA IA is the most specific compliance requirement. Then FSMA. Then above that is Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. And then you've got some other things like import, Homeland Security type laws, looking at smuggling and things that are still a part of that in the big picture. And then beyond that is GFSI. As GFSI's food defense requirement is all types of food defense, including disgruntled employees, malicious tampering, things like that. So that's the way to look at the key. So is the key activity types enough? Well, it depends on exactly which compliance requirement you're testing against. So if it is IA rule, then it sounds like you've probably got it. But if you start to look broader, then it may not be there. Because again, if it's GFSI, then it covers malicious malicious tampering and things like that. Now, separately to look at food fraud, I think that the key is I mean, as recommendations, I mean, I think our training is pretty broad and free. So the MOOCs are a good place to start as an overview. And then there are definitely tools, and like the S-Safe vulnerability assessment walks you through a survey set of questions, and you can start very, very high. And that's in our Vassap MOOC. We go through the initial screening process, and that's where it could be just three of us get together and look at your entire company from the top down. And we try to, 5 types of suppliers, 5 types of products. And usually then out of that box of 5 by 5 is 25 cells. Usually we find like 2 are the worst ones, or 2 are the ones of concern. And we use that to dig into those 2, and we go further from the top down. And that's really, I think, the way to look at this. It's really the only way to look at it. If you look bottom up, think of that company that had 800 products. And all of a sudden, then how do you put that data together? It's really most efficient to look from the top down. Now, from the food defense side of it, if you've got the IA rule pretty much covered, let's say that someone's looked at it and at least they haven't freaked out when they looked at it. I still think that to go back, and we cover it in the audit guide, is to then look at your company overall. So from food defense threats, you can, I mean, the basic risk management is the same for food safety, food fraud, food defense. So you look at like 5 types, you look at incidents and to see what are you worried about. Are you worried about someone, jumping over the fence and accessing a tank? Let's say that that's the worst case you have. You looked at, infiltrating, you looked at in the supply chain, blah, 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 blah. And the worst one is the outside attacker accessing a bulk storage. That's the one area. Well, all of a sudden you're at the very top looking at that. And from there, then you can then dig in, and that helps you to understand these other risks are important, but this is the worst one. We need to deal with this one first in a very, very broad sense. So that, I think that helps, and that doesn't help for you. I think
it does, and thanks for that. I think what I heard was that yes, the key activity types addresses the IA rule. However, it would behoove us to go further into food fraud using those tools that you mentioned, and so I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would say that the reading closely those final rules, they're clear to say this guidance is for adherence to this rule, and there's 7 rules, but those 7 rules don't cover all of FSMA. And even some people don't know it. They think if I'm compliant with all 7 final rules, I've covered all FSMA. That's not the case. So FSMA is this big, look behind me. So there's all this wall, and then there's these different final rules, right? So you could be fine for this rule right here, but that doesn't mean you're compliant with that rule or that rule, or what's down here in the white area. So that's it. That's a key, is to those final rules help you with this really important topic, but it's not everything. And that's the key then, to step back and look at the big picture. Now, it doesn't mean maybe these other areas, maybe there's nothing with smuggling. If you buy your product all in the state of New York from people in New York, you never cross a border, then your role is not to look at smuggling. If you happen to buy product from Pennsylvania or from Ontario, then you have some other areas to look at. I'd say anybody else, what about that? Does that make sense from the kind of the food defense big picture standpoint?
John, this is Lena Bush. I appreciate your presentation, and I'm listening to it from a different perspective, because I actually come from one of the certification bodies. So we're in and out of a lot of facilities because you've got to re-earn your program. So you re-earn your certificate in SQF or ISO 22000.
Yep.
So I appreciate the time you took to, maybe because I am also in the field for sales, and too often I ask about the level of food safety, and they say, oh, we're GFSI. So I appreciate that you took the time to say, okay, well, which one? You picked one program to follow, and surely they did. One of the takeaways I got from your presentation, though, is don't do it piecemeal. If you're going to do a threat assessment, even if there's no hazard, like, show your work on how you got there.
It's required. Yeah. And people think, people have told me before, stolen goods, we don't think that's a problem for us. We're not going to look at it. So, okay, show me your analysis. Oh, we didn't do an analysis. It's clear. FSMA is crystal clear. Now, will the FDA, in an FDA audit, when nothing's wrong, will they look closely to see if you've done you've documented a hazard analysis for stolen goods or things like that? No. But the key is what's compliant. No, so then you want to say to your company, oh yeah, we're not compliant with the whole law. We're only compliant with part of it. I have a feeling that they would want you to be compliant with the whole law. So.
But I also appreciate the balance of don't create it more complicated than it needs to be. So I really did, those takeaways I think were really key. Don't try to your 800 tabs or your sunscreen, somewhere in between 800 tabs and not applying the sunscreen is the good fit. Thanks so much.
Yeah, the hard part is that we're looking at, you're starting with Vassap, and then you're looking at this completely new topic. And food fraud and food safety are not the same things. Completely different set of likelihoods, consequences, vulnerabilities, system weaknesses, countermeasures, completely different. But you start with Vassap, and Vassap has a certain heft to it, right? And you feel like food fraud has to have the same type of heft. If there's not that huge body of work that you're not doing things right, that's not the case. Think about Vassap 25 years ago, very different than Vassap now. And it didn't all of a sudden come up as this big refined efficient system. And it's big and refined because of dangers. And food fraud's at the very beginning. It's really fundamentally different. So if anything, my big goal is that you are confident doing everything you need to do, but it doesn't seem like a lot. There's so many times people say, well, I got to do more than this. And I said, well, why? Let's look at it. You have very few vulnerabilities because you buy from the food distributor in New York. It's basically a shelf stable product. I don't see any other why you need to do more. But the key is the very start is to not just go piecemeal upwards, to look at the big picture down. We call it a corkscrew approach. So at the very beginning, it could be just 3 of us together looking at your entire company. We did it for a country it was at a Mexican quick serve restaurant. We did it over about an hour for an entire country. We looked at the very top and said, okay, generally, how do products come into the country? Different types of brokers, direct ship, blah, blah, blah. And then what type of products? Dairy, meat, whatever. And so you start at the very high level, but you cover everything. So we looked at that and we saw that there were two big areas that were the concern. Actually, for them, they're looking at import and export. So it was meat coming into the country and meat being exported were the two biggies, because they eat a lot of meat. They bring a lot of meat in of some kinds. They also are a big meat producer, and their meat is really, really high quality. So we identified the two areas out of everything else, not milk, not counterfeit liquor, not other things. We started very high and identified those two areas. Now, later, will they look at everything else? Sure. But I don't know about you, but we don't have unlimited resources. We have to prioritize. So that is the real key of starting light and simple. That doesn't mean you're done, but you do that first pass, and then you go deeper only where you need to go. And the auditor, I think, has a key role in that, to help to give some guidance. Like FSSC 22000 has a guidance document on food fraud and food defense. They've got that there so that people know what they're supposed to be doing. That makes the audit efficient as well. And then the auditor can make specific comments about part of that guidance and the results to lead to either what corrective action needs to be in place now to help them calibrate, or what in the year, what will kind of be a maturity model. Thank you.
So I have a question that is a little bit more of a philosophical one, I guess. But so if there's a supplier who has been caught with intentional or probably intentional, maybe accidental food contamination, food adulteration, is there a path back for that supplier? Which actions should a company take? Do you just like say, we're never doing business with you again? Is there a path back? Like, what do you think?
Well, at the very start, so I drive people crazy sometimes. Either I always want to know the definition of exactly how they define what they're doing at the very beginning, or the key is asking a very specific question, document a very specific question. So that's the question to ask. So as you see, that's kind of like the maturity of the food fraud model. You're now saying, gosh, if we put this in place, we actually find somebody, what should we do? So that was so let's say that you and I are the food safety team. There's two of us. Then we'd say, well, what do we think? And at the start is to say, well, what would we do for food safety? We'd notify them, we do this. What would we do if it's like criminal activity? Would we contact the state police, the FDA? What would we do in these other, like smuggled? Let's say that you figured it was smuggled goods. What would you do in that situation? But the thing is, we're just asking this question. So at that point, then you and I on the team, we'd write up, the question is, what do we do if we find somebody? Answer, if it was that, in the past, we've done it this way, but then we're not the decision makers. We're not officers of the company. It's for us to then go up through the process to say into compliance, hey, this is a question we have. This is how we think was a good response. What do you think? And then, but the key is, look at that you now have gone from, we got to do something about food fraud, to that's the management system. That's how would we respond to a certain situation. That's way down in the standard operating procedures. That's exactly what you want. You also, but the thing is, the first time we do that and we send it to compliance, does it take time? Yes. And we're thinking about new things. Nothing is worse than looking at a blank piece of paper to say, but if you start just simple, then it fills out, but then it goes to compliance. They can say this, they say, well, we'd like to have a legal look at it, and then it comes back to you. And someone either tells you, yes, it's okay. No, it's not. They don't tell you anything, or here's an adjustment. But now then you and I as a team, we now have in our standard operating procedures what we would do in that case. So food fraud prevention strategy has a lot of, just like any other policy guide you have, or there's a flow chart. If this happens, then do this, then do that. Do we do more testing first? Do we, whatever it is. And you're now getting to the detail. The key is, once we do that, we now have it documented, and this should be in like your official corporate policy, system of what then now that might not be technically a policy, but it's under the food fraud activities are, if there's a problem, here's what it is. And then someone later can audit that. They can also ask you, that's a real key from the corporate bosses, is that here's what they want. You have a process, you follow it, and you update it. Now, I don't care what it is at your company. Could be anything, could be shoveling the snow, could be vacation policy, that the boss wants to say, Donna, for your business, Do you have process? Do you follow it? Do you update it? And that's where if you can say yes, then they're far along. But at that point, then someone can come in and audit it. So later, internal auditor looks at to make sure that we're following the right steps. They could see that. Then they'll ask you, okay, tell me 3 times that this did occur. Did you contact
did
them,
you
and what
do?
happened? Yeah.
Mhm.
And that ultimately that makes it easier for us. And then when you get promoted to VP or win the lottery and aren't here, we have the documentation to state why we did what we did, and it's there. That's a management system. It's no longer just John and Donna working together, and it works. A lot of times that happens, like, oh, I don't know what they do, but let's just keep letting them do it. We really need to move to the management system because it actually does help us. Then you and I, when it happens, because wait, all recalls happen at, or 90% of recalls happen at 4:45 on Friday, right? So
Yeah, or
so when it's
Saturday.
4:45 on Friday, we're not thinking, wait, where's Donna? Did I catch her call? What are we going to do? Boom, 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 boom. We know that there's a procedure in place. So, and in the future, if there's a problem with it, like if someone says, John and Donna, what are you doing? That's crazy. You shouldn't do that. You're not calling and say, whoa, okay, that's great. Let's get, hey, here it is. Let's talk about it. Would you like us to do something different the next time? Because this is the one we sent to compliance and legal. And oh, but you didn't send it to operations. Great. Okay. Hey, operations, take a look at it. So, and the key is
Yeah,
that
okay.
documentation. It
Okay.
sounds like I'm proposing, change the world, whatever. It's actually, these things make it so simple for you because you now have it laid out, and then people tell you what's enough or what's not. The other side of that is that if let's say we identify 20 things a week that we have to do, and every one of those is 15 minutes, John and Donna as a team want to have those activities documented. Because you can't just keep adding 15 minutes, 15 minutes, 15 minutes. Now you can. A lot of times they do, but usually it's up to us to define to HR the work process and to say, look, we've got 20 things that take 15 minutes because it's new food fraud stuff. Do you want us to stop doing them or add it? And all of a sudden say, well, wait, you know what? They need another quarter person to do it. Because there's also the risk side of that is that if we just kind of condense it into our job, that 15 minutes is coming up from someplace else. And at first, no one wants to hear it, right? No, just go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
But then at some point, let's say there's a problem, and it realizes, well, there's going to be some stress here because of this risk. So, or they tell you then not to do it. That those are activities that don't need to be done, or they're like not mandatory.
Interesting. Thank you. We have another question from John Luker. He said, great presentation. The thoughts on making the survey that you've talked about a regulation at the state or local level tied to, say, a license or permit. I know this has been discussed within the states, but if the motive is fraudulent financial gain, would there be much value? I suppose it could have the fraud actively identified or passively not identified in writing.
So yeah, well, here I've got a question for you. How much over the speed limit do you drive on the highway?
I'm not answering that question.
Right. So there's right there. So let's say that a government agency asked, the Department of Transportation sent that to you with your driver's license, or yes or no, do you drive over the speed limit on the highway? Yes or no. How often do you drive over the speed limit? If you drive later today, do you confirm that you will be driving over the speed limit? Yes or no. So wait a second, you're now admitting that every time you drive, you break the law. Now, but I've never been pulled over. I never got in an accident. Okay, where does the actual law threshold fit in? But the bottom line is, if you're asked, now you have to say something. So let's say you do ask all your suppliers. So the criminals say, yeah, we've got a food fraud vulnerability assessment. We don't have any food. Yeah, we don't have any fraud. Yes, we're GFSI compliant. Yes, we've done the vulnerability assessment. Yes, we got a preventive strategy. Yes. Now that's giving information to a government agency, or you as let's say it's your food company. Still, the company has said, yes, we have all of these. Now you could follow up and say, oh, you said you're GFSI compliant. Who was the auditor? What company? What person did it? What date did they do it? Now it gets a little bit fuzzy because bad guys don't like to leave their fingerprints. And if you ask them, yes or no, do you drive over the speed limit? Yes or no, are you gonna drive over the speed limit today? Then if someone, then that forces them to ask. So, or to answer. So in that case, then if they say yes, you could say, oh, just send us over your vulnerability assessment and the name of the person that did the audit. Public information. That's all public information stuff, or only ask public information. And that then starts to lead where you pull at a thread and it can start to unravel. The key is there's been a couple companies, one specifically that had honey was about half their product. And they started, and my recommendation was start to talk to your suppliers, promote that you're looking at food fraud prevention to be a good customer. The goal is not to catch food fraud. The goal is to prevent it from occurring in the first place. Now, if you have unlimited resources, knock yourself out. Go catch everybody possible. I just read in the paper that that there's a couple courts in state of Michigan that are like 2 years behind because of case backlog from COVID and other things and lack of staff. Also, a lot of cases in play and stuff. So it was even like it was terrible. It was like domestic violence. That with COVID, it was such a spike that the court couldn't keep up. But the bottom line is you're entering, so that enforcement is tough, but we'd like it to all stop. And as with food fraud, we're trying to prevent it. So by asking the questions, then all of a sudden they had half as many people bidding on their honey business the next time around. And the CFO asked, do you think that's because of they were fraudulent? I said, well, I don't know exactly those brokers from whatever country it was from, but you'd think that if you were selling us product that was fraudulent and I started to talk about food fraud, you wouldn't sell it to us. You wouldn't bid on our business. And if you could only win our business because it's fraudulent product, low cost fraudulent, then you'd stop bidding on it. If you suspected that the people you bought from were fraudulent, that we bought to sell to you or broker to you, then you'd stop bidding on that business as well. That's what you want. Now, the company said, well, John, you're making our prices go up. I said, I thought, let me think about that a minute. Your prices go up because the fraudulent criminals aren't bidding on your business, because you're no longer buying fraudulent product. And you unless it's stolen goods that's of high quality, then you do suffer as a business. Now, the stolen goods would be illegal anyway. So that'd be adulterated foods. You're not sure of the handling. So that would be, you'd be buying and selling illegal product, but really you're being defrauded. So your costs go up because you're no longer defrauded. So asking the survey, even knowing that criminals will just lie is part of the equation, because we're asking them, have you conducted this? Who did it? Or have you done it? And then later the follow-up is, oh, you told us that you have it, can you, look, hey, you've already got it. So, okay, it's what time is it? It's almost noon. Hey, by 3 o'clock, just, can you email it over to us? Oh, well, I need a week for that. Oh, interesting. Why do you need a week to do that? Because if you already are GFSI compliant, you already have it. You've already got approval to show it to an auditor. And you said it was that auditor. You said it was Betsy who audited us on November 1 last year. So why do you need it? And then, again, you can identify that and have prevention.
Are there any other questions? Excuse me, or any other hands raised? I'm not seeing any.
Okay. Well, I think kind of as a closing statement or something is that there is a lot out there. You have to prioritize what you're working on. I think to take a moment to think about if this is something that's required for you, and how you feel about what you've been doing already. I think a key from the questions that were asked, I think that the audit guide, we have the food defense and the food fraud audit guide. I'll go back up to the product list. I think those would be two good places to start, because those are looking exactly at the requirements themselves. Whether you're a government agency, auditors, or companies. A second. Oh, there we go. So see, there's these two here: food fraud prevention audit guide and food defense threat audit guide. those will give you really good first steps on what are the really core requirements. And as I said later on, I said that the big key is you identifying what you're working on. Like the one question about key activity types, that's for FSMA IA rule. If that's the question, then you look at the FSMA IA rule to see what you've got. And once you finish that, well, I would say if you haven't started looking at a compliance requirement, then look broadly, because you might as well at least set up your plan to look at what's all food defense. And then, well, right now we're only going to work on this piece, but to know how that would fit in to the others, there's some efficiency there. We definitely cover that in that food defense MOOC. Well, I'll say thank you. Stay in touch. Yeah. And maybe next year when it's in person, we can actually get together. Love to get back out.
That would be great. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. This has been a wonderful presentation, and we really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. So here's Toria has started screen sharing. This is the QR code evaluation link that we talked about earlier. So you should be able to just put that, use the camera on your phone to scan that QR code, and it'll take you to a website link. And we'll leave that up for a few minutes here. And we are 3 minutes short of noon, which is our half an hour break for lunch. We will start again back at 12:30. And while we are on break, we will have the logos of some of our sponsors and sustaining members up on the screen. So take a minute to look at those supporters of our organization while we are on break and while we're coming back from break. So thanks everybody for coming this morning, and we'll see you in half an hour.